They say knowledge is power, but education funding is declining worldwide, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Sub-Saharan Africa. In a region strained by poverty, security issues and child marriages, can international organizations come together to close the chapter on illiteracy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Ending poverty often begins with a solid foundation for education, but teaching the future leaders of tomorrow is an investment, and it's currently more than $3 billion short. At least 264 million children and teenagers worldwide aren't receiving the education they need, and that is largely due to underfunding. The total's around a quarter of the entire population of Europe. The United Nations says children in the poorest countries are 9 times more likely to miss school than in rich ones. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rate of exclusion. More than a fifth of 6 to 11-year-olds don't even go to school. Neither do a third of 12 to 14-year-olds, or almost 60% aged between 15 and 17. So clearly a big problem. And to help developing nations reach the goal of educating every child, the Global Partnership for Education has been holding a funding conference in Senegal. Nicholas Hack has more from Dakar.
There's been conferences like this before where world leaders and heads of organizations come together to promise to prioritize education. And while aid for developing countries has increased in the last decade, it hasn't for education. In some areas, it's even dropped. Donor countries, mostly Western countries, are donating less towards education. It's instead donating money towards climate change or fighting terrorism. And this has dramatic effects on young children across the world. 234 million children are out of school. Half of them are young girls. We spoke to the former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, who's spearheading this conference, and this is what she had to say.
If we can lift the quality of education, then we can make a difference to the long-term employability of the children that come out of school. If I can kind of reverse the picture, we know on current trends that of the 1.6 billion young people who will be alive in 2030, more than half of them will emerge from school, if we don't act, with less than lower secondary level skills. There's no way to get a job in the economy of the 21st century.
Now, there are protests in several countries in West Africa, in Chad and Niger, and beyond, in Tunisia and in France, teachers taking to the streets asking for better pay and working conditions. This conference is hoping to raise $2 billion a year for the next 2 years for education. At stake is millions of children and their ability to go to school.
Let's bring in the panel. I'm joined in the studio by Mary Joy Pigozzi. She's the Director of Educated Child. It's an initiative set up in Qatar with the goal of making sure 10 million children get a primary education this year. From Dakar, Wadi Ben-Hirki. She's a young female leader from Adamawa State in northern Nigeria, founded the Wadi Ben-Hirki Foundation, which helps marginalised women get an education. And via Skype from London, Joseph Nhan O'Reilly, the Head of Education Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children. Very warm welcome to all three of you. Let me start off with you, Wadi Ben-Hirki, because you represent what we are seeing in so many parts of the world, particularly in Africa at the moment. Somebody who missed the education system, but you were lucky enough to get into it and are now a success. Tell us a little bit about your findings and your story.
I'm one of the privileged young girls from that region to have gotten quality education, but that is not the case for so many thousands of other girls my age are married and probably have so many children, and I'm just 21. So that is why I founded the organization, because I was tired of all the issues that I was seeing and the number of girls who were suffering from this challenge. And then I started it in 2015. I was between 17 and 18 years old then. I hadn't enough funds, but I just had the passion and I was determined to help girls get an education I'm also a champion in one campaign, and one is an organization that advocates for girl inclusion in education and access to other opportunities. And that is why we have our major campaign, which is Girls Count, saying that there are 130 million girls that are out of school around the world, and they deserve a right to education. Thank you.
So there's an example of somebody who has succeeded because of education. But there are so many countries in Africa, for example, where many children fall out of the education system. And we're going to focus on the youngest nation in the world, South Sudan. Hibba Morgan has the story from Juba.
It's not class time, but Buldeng says he wishes he could go to school. His school, however, is not like it used to be. It's now in a UN camp for displaced people, where he's been since he fled fighting in his hometown in the north of the country.
When the fighting took place, our schools were destroyed and my brother and I were afraid we'd be recruited by armed groups, so we ran to the UN camps for safety. Now I miss my old school and friends.
Buldeng is one of more than 60,000 children receiving education in UN camps around South Sudan. The civil war, now in its 5th year, has seen thousands of people killed and millions displaced. It's also had a major impact on education, with 1.8 million or 70% of school-age children not getting any. The United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF, says 1 in every 3 schools have been destroyed, damaged, occupied or closed at least once during the war. And even in those areas where there is no fighting, there are still challenges to be faced getting access to education. South Sudan's constitution provides free education, but students have to pay schools for registration and for uniforms and exam fees. With the war weakening the economy, many families struggle to find the money and pull their children out of school. Most of those forced to leave are girls. Nancy Kafuki is one of them.
I used to go to school, but my father passed away and my mother couldn't afford to pay the registration fees for me and my siblings, so now I don't attend classes. I don't feel good about that. The rest of the kids get to go to school and I can't go.
The UN says South Sudan has one of the highest illiteracy rates in the world, about 3 out of every 4 people. And there are concerns the war will ensure that rate goes even higher.
Basically, UNICEF is very concerned that almost a whole generation, 30% is just about 1/3 of the entire school-going population, are not going to school, and how adverse will that impact the future of this country when almost entire generation will grow up not having gone to school.
For Nancy Kafuki and Buldeng, they know what it is like to sit in a classroom. They hope the situation in their country changes and changes soon, so they can continue with their education and be part of a brighter future. Hibba Morgan, Al Jazeera, Juba.
Mary Joy Pigozzi, I mean, this really encapsulates the problems that lead to a lack of education, doesn't it? That story. I mean, how do you even get children to the education stage when they've got to overcome so many obstacles?
Well, I think one of the things we have learned in the years that we've been working here and working through a partnership model in over 50 countries is that you really have to address the barriers that keep children out of school. And in identifying those barriers, it really is about understanding where the child is, where the child's coming from, and what he or she needs to overcome that. In many cases, it's multiple barriers. So we've talked a little bit about South Sudan, where it's poverty compounded by conflict, often compounded by gender. So there are many different barriers that children face. And what I think we have to do as a community is really understand better that the traditional systems don't always work for these children.
The last mile, it must be breaking years of tradition and understanding of how a family structure, for example, should work. The fact that the woman is the one who goes out and does most of the work on the farms or whatever it is in many of these situations.
And what we're seeing now with conflict is that, in fact, roles are changing incredibly. So if we look at what's happened with the Syrian refugees, many of the women are with their families, but without their husbands or the older boys in the family. So things are really changing and very fluid. So then poverty becomes even more of an issue. Employment becomes an issue. So I think what we're looking at is a really fast-changing world in which we really need to be nimble, and adaptable and willing to go the extra mile to find those folks and help them.
And Joseph Nhan O'Reilly, when it comes to Save the Children and education and the sort of challenges that you are seeing on a day-to-day basis, talk us through them and how hard they are to overcome.
Well, you've painted a very compelling picture of the need in South Sudan and elsewhere. That situation, unfortunately, is replicated all over the world. There are massive needs. The first of which, of course, is whether education is provided, so the access question. But we also know, unfortunately, that even being in school isn't a guarantee that children will learn. There's a growing concern that the quality of teaching, the lack of materials, means that many children will get to grade 3 or grade 4 and not be able to read at the standard which we would expect. So there are big challenges. We talk about the crisis of learning, the access challenge on the one hand, where there are millions of children out of school and who don't have the opportunity to do what they should be, and which is going to school on the one hand, and then the fact that they're not learning in school at the other. And of course, a big factor for us is that conflict and forced displacement compound this challenge. Many children can't go to school because their schools are attacked, or they've been forced to flee their homes and to safely settle in another country, which is now responsible for providing them with an education.
Wadi, that must be an enormous concern, isn't it? When you actually do get kids into class, and yet there's no education there. They leave school and they're not educated. They still can't read. And they still can't write. I mean, is this a case of just getting bottoms onto seats so that you can tick a box?
I would like to say that most children that go through school but are really not educated, it's because governments generally invest in free education but not free quality education. I believe there is a difference. They may generally focus on the number of girls or children that will go to school through their free education, but not, okay, how many girls have quality education. And also because teachers are not being made priority as well. I believe if teachers are paid well, if the environment is conducive for learning, and there are other things like materials they need, like textbooks and other stationery, they would learn. But that is the issue. You go to schools and you see girls and boys sitting on windows, sitting on mats, sitting outside, for example, under the trees, and they're meant to be in school, and they say they don't pay fees, just tuition, just because it's free. But it isn't quality, and that is why we have so many people that, for example, would graduate, but you see that they can barely read or write. So in trying to give many people access to education by making it free, they should also make it quality, and also make the teachers, give the staff, treat them right, basically, pay them well, and also there should be incentives which they should use so they will be motivated to teach these children well. And also the children should, teaching should be a very, it's something they should enjoy, not just because they need to go to school, but they know the importance. There should be innovative and creative ways in which they will be taught, and not just formal education, skills, other trainings that would help them to want to go to school and to make them better, basically.
Obviously, that's the aim, isn't it, Mary? But it must be really hard to motivate some of those teachers who haven't been possibly properly educated, who are refugees themselves, and who are possibly teaching children who are suffering from malnourishment, who are starving.
I think there's two things. One is all the time I've been an educator, stunned by the engagement and the involvement and the commitment of teachers, even though the conditions are not very good. So I think that's one thing we need to think about when we talk about this, is to really understand that teachers are doing their best under the circumstances. The circumstances are often horrible. I think the other piece, you talked about malnutrition, or perhaps we look at psychosocial concerns. We really need to look at the whole child. We need to understand that it's not just the classroom that's the problem. The problem is really multifaceted, and we need to bring together the pieces in a way that makes sense in that environment. So in one environment, it might be school feeding that's important. In another, it might be psychosocial healing. In yet another, it might be working with the community on income-generating activities so they can pay school fees. So I think what's the challenge for us as educators and the rest of the world is understanding that one size does not fit all.
That's what I was going to ask you. If you can't have one size fit all, how do you roll that out? I mean, you can't. You've got to keep adapting it.
Well, you have to be adaptable, and actually what's learning about? Learning is about adapting. It's about getting information, figuring it out, and going forward. And our colleague talked earlier about education being fun. Learning is fun if it's good learning. And I think that's where we've sort of fallen down a little bit, is to not understand that we need to really look at the variety of learners and how can we reach those learners, because they all bring something to the classroom. They bring something that's powerful, and we need to work with that, because with that and with funding, we can move forward.
Okay. Everybody has touched on girls, and obviously that's an important factor when it comes to education. So let's take a look at how this plays out in this scenario. There are twice as many uneducated girls as there are boys. According to UNESCO, more than 130 million girls are out of school for reasons like safety concerns, poverty, or simply because they were forced to grow up too fast, looking after the family, for example. More than 100 million young women living in low-income households they can't read or write. Attacks on girls' schools force parents to keep their children at home. An estimated 15 million girls a year are married under the age of 18. Educated girls are 3 times less likely to marry in their teens. Joseph, talk us through the importance of getting girls, in particular, through the education system. I know we touched on it briefly a little earlier on, but how important is it for society as a whole to get them educated, to get them making decisions?
Well, it's absolutely critical, and I don't think anyone needs to be told that. One of the great things I would say is that there are lots of barriers to girls, which you've outlined, getting into school, and it is obviously essential, from the most basic human right that everyone has to an education, to the case that you've made for education in preventing disease, in improving livelihoods, and in supporting national economic growth and well-being. And women are vital to all of that, so women have to be educated. The good thing is that we are making progress on this aspect of education, and more girls are going to school. The statistics which you outlined are also true, in that we've still got a long way to go, but we are seeing progress, and that's really welcome. The other thing, of course, is that we are building on the demand of girls themselves to go to school. Girls want to be in school, and we're meeting that demand. And as we've already seen on the program today with our colleague from Nigeria, they're terrific advocates of themselves, and we need to build on their commitment and passion to get back into school and have learning opportunities which are meaningful to them and their countries.
Wadi, Nigeria obviously has the Boko Haram problem, the Chibok girls who were kidnapped. Reintegrating girls who've faced that sort of trauma, I mean, how difficult is it to reintegrate them, and what sort of support do you get from the government to help them get back into society?
At the moment, I would start with statistics. Nigeria has about 43% of girls who marry before age 18. We have 10.5 million out-of-school children, and girls make up 60% of that population. And if nothing is done very soon, it will be on the increase, and the rate will grow, which will be very, very bad in terms of to Nigeria and the world at large. And I would say the governments, they say they're trying their best, and I think they are, because based on news, some of them have been found and returned back to Nigeria. I don't really know about that, but that's what we hear. But I would say that this issue could have been avoided if there was more security, proper security, and if girls were being placed as equal to boys, because I don't know how to put it. How would you say girls went to school and they were just abducted? That is very bad, and I believe there are many others who have been abducted. It's only that they didn't make news headlines. So I would say the government is trying their best, but they can do much more better. And that is only when they make education and they make girls priority in the society. Thank you.
All right, Joseph, we've laid out the problems that Africa and many other countries, continents face. What is the ultimate aim now for any education system, and particularly in these areas? And how a summit that we can see that is underway at the moment can possibly help?
Well, the global goals, which the international community have committed to, are very clear. We want to provide quality, equitable opportunities for children to go to school and, in fact, for lifelong learning. Unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the new Sustainable Development Goal for education starts before school and goes right up into adult education. So it's much more ambitious than the previous goal of universal primary education. That is, in a sense, the agreed ambition. But we're a long way for achieving that. And I think one of the key barriers to that is insufficient financing. There's not enough money being invested by nation states in their own education systems. And as the report that opened this program illustrated, education aid is on the decline. And we're having the Global Partnership for Education Replenishment Conference today in Dakar, and we're hoping for the very best outcome there, which provides the beginning of a breakthrough in turning the financial crisis that is affecting education around and ensuring that countries have enough funding to deliver on the ambitions which we've all agreed and set ourselves.
I mean, Mary, from a financial point of view, it's a no-brainer to finance education, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, we've done some research that shows that it's more expensive to countries to not educate their children than to educate them. It costs them in GDP. We know that. So it is a no-brainer. But it is all about priorities. It is all about focus. I think the Global Partnership for Education has done an extraordinary job of bringing together people, bringing together countries, and really trying to move the needle. But it's very clear we need billions. But if we don't invest these billions, we're really going to have more problems in the future. There's going to be more disparity, more wars, more poverty, and really more problems for all of us, not just the poor. And I think that's the piece we need to understand.
How do you convince people, though, to cough up this money? I mean, there is donor fatigue. Everyone talks about it all the time. Everybody's sick and tired, they say, about the pictures of people suffering, which is extraordinary. But how do you really get people to put the money on the table and deliver what they promise? Because that's particularly hard, isn't it?
I think that's a great question, and I think one of the things we really have to do, those of us that are in the education community and the development community, is show results. We have to begin to show the difference we are making. And I think one of the things we need to do as an international community is to really explore what has worked and what hasn't worked, and where things have not worked, give them up. And that's a very hard thing to do for big institutions that have had particular priorities over a long period of time. So I think that's one area. I think a second area is to begin to look at the global community more generally and understand that none of us, the president of a country, the head of a corporation, the head of some startup in India, nobody would be there without some basic education at least. And we need to begin to tap into those people to have them understand that their work is not going to continue. They're not going to continue to have the kind of growth they want if they don't invest in others the way somebody invested in them. And I think that's a hard thing to pitch. We have to figure out how to do it.
And you investigate in children today. What do you have tomorrow?
You have all sorts of great things. I mean, our colleagues have already talked about it a little bit, but once we invest in children, we end up with more innovation, we end up with less poverty, we end up with less disparity, we end up with more creativity. When we bring everybody in, we really do bring in everybody. We don't know how many Einsteins or Gandhis or Mandelas we are losing just because we're letting them fall by the wayside. They aren't counted, therefore they don't count.
What a waste. Let's leave it on those words. Thank you very much, Mary Joy Pigozzi. Thank you to Wadi Ben-Hirki and Joseph Nhan O'Reilly. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/ AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. Big thank you from me and the rest of the team. Bye for now.